The following is a conversation with Liana Fix. Dr. Fix is a fellow for Europe at the Council on Foreign Relations. She is a historian and political scientist with expertise in German and European foreign and security policy, European security, transatlantic relations, Russia, and Eastern Europe. She is also the author of A New German Power, Germany's Role in European Russian Policy. Dr. Fix's work focuses on German domestic and foreign policy, the European Union, transatlantic relations, and Europe's relations with Russia and China. Prior to joining the Council on Foreign Relations, Dr. Fix was Program Director for International Affairs at the Korbor Stiftung in Berlin. She was also a resident fellow at the German Marshall Fund in Washington, D.C., and a fellow at the American Institute for Contemporary German Studies. From 2018 to 2019, she was a fellow for Global Governance Futures at the Robert Bosch Foundation Multilateral Dialogues. From 2014 to 2016, Dr. Fix was a doctoral fellow at the German Institute for International and Security Affairs and associate fellow at the German Council on Foreign Relations. From 2012 to 2013, Dr. Fix worked as a Mercator Fellow for International Affairs at the German Federal Foreign Office, the EU delegation in Tbilisi, and the Carnegie Moscow Center. Dr. Fix has contributed essays, policy papers, and articles to peer-reviewed journals including Foreign Affairs, Foreign Policy, and the Washington Quarterly, among others. She's also a frequent contributor to international and German language media. If you enjoyed the conversation and enjoy the content, I please ask you to rate, subscribe, and follow the page on Twitter and Instagram at Overcoming the Divide. Thank you. Thank you for being here today, Liana. I really appreciate your time and presence.
Thank you.
Could you tell me a little bit about yourself, where you're from, some of your interests, and what you're currently pursuing, say?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm a fellow for Europe at the Council on Foreign Relations based in Washington, D.C. I cover mostly German foreign policy, European foreign policy, Ukraine and Russia. I've been doing a lot on the war in Ukraine recently. And I'm born in Germany. I'm a German citizen.
Awesome. Thank you. Now, I first would like to take a look at a developing topic, which is the Nord Stream pipeline. I saw you personally wrote a little bit about it in Twitter feed, but I'd like to also take a diver or a deep little diver into it. And I just want to know how likely, first to begin with, how likely you think it is that a pro-Ukrainian group with no affiliation to the Ukrainian state or any government for that matter orchestrated and executed that operation?
Yeah, I find that very difficult to assess because from the outside, it's very difficult to understand how the operation was conducted. So what we do have is an investigation from German investigative journalists who talk to many of those who are investigating the issue in Germany and across Europe at the moment. And they found indications that it was not kind of this big project by a state naval actor, but it seemed to be a project on a smaller scale if what the investigation has revealed is confirmed. So a smaller boat which was rented and used for blowing up the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. So those are all preliminary investigation results. They have not been confirmed or proven or not been officially published so far. But what these results say is that there are links to Ukraine. They do not exclude a false flag operation, but they also say that they haven't found hints for a false flag operation. So at the moment, it's still pretty much open. It gives obviously a lot of ground and a lot of reason to speculate, and it gives a lot of ammunition for conspiracy theories about Nord Stream 2, which have been there from the start, including the theory that it was the United States. I would just advise to be cautious with any preliminary conclusions at the moment, because I think it doesn't help to contribute to a debate with assessments of, likeliness or not likeliness, as long as the facts are not all confirmed and published and on the table.
Originally, though, just a pushback, I guess, a little was people in certain outlets and groups came out to say it was Russia, even though there really wasn't any indication of that.
I think the idea behind that was that Russia would have some kind of motivation to prevent that Germany can continue to use the pipeline. And obviously, in a war like this, there have been concerns about sabotage on infrastructure, Western infrastructure, from the beginning. So it kind of seemed to fit a potential playbook. But again, as long as there are no proofs on the table, it's difficult to disprove Russia or to prove Russia's involvement there. It's made sense why it was the first conclusion that many people drew from the attack. But again, I would advise to wait for the results of the investigation.
Understood. I think some people are skeptical that it would be a pro-Ukraine group with no government or state affiliation or ties because of the phenomenal OPSEC or OPSEC, I guess is how you pronounce it, OPSEC, that they would have to maintain the large amounts of C4 and detonation material, as well as just world-class intelligence capabilities that this group would also have to have as well. And not to mention that's only 12 miles off the border of a NATO country or NATO like waters there. Therefore,
yeah, I think these are all justified questions and justified concerns. But again, I mean, in history, there have been many sabotage acts or many crimes pulled off by an unlikely actor under unlikely circumstances. So I think this should not give reason to accuse Ukraine or to undermine the support for Ukraine. Because all articles that were published so far on that also say there's no indication of an involvement of the Ukrainian leadership in this. But at the same time, again, to not rule out the possibility of a false flag operation. And if it has been, as was also suggested, an operation with links to Ukraine, that does not mean that it should necessarily influence any of the positions that were taken towards Ukraine in the past. And that's certainly a position where Germany finds itself and which can become sort of a balancing act in the future, because there will be a strong emphasis on, well, whatever happened with Nord Stream 2, this will not change the fact that Ukraine is at war, that Ukraine is attacked, and that it needs continuous support.
I find that a little interesting because if this was hypothetically, let's put that out there, hypothetically, Ukraine, the state did have ties to this operation, that means they would willingly commit a flagrant act of aggression in open waters that could possibly escalate the war without the consent and direction or just kind of communication of their allies.
Again, there are no indications so far that that is the case, and nothing has been suggested in that direction.
But no, I'm pointing to your latter point, which mentioned that if this was Ukraine and they were affiliated, then that would be the case. They would be taking an action if they would be taking an action that could dramatically escalate the war if that was the case. So that's why I think I have trouble, I guess, understanding how that would not change a relationship. Maybe not in terms of aid, but in regards to how intelligence is happening, how we're communicating ourselves. The United States, for one, is backstopping their military efforts, most of their military efforts in their entire economy. And for this now to be a third instance, say, if this was the case, hypothetically, if this was the case, a third instance that Ukraine carried out military operations that the United States and other NATO allies would not, say, approve of, I don't see why that would not be more than a reason to reassess how we're communicating the situation with Ukraine there. The first two being the assassination of a highly ranking oligarch daughter, Russian's daughter, and the second one being that bridge sabotage bombing. The bridge's name is eluding my mind, but in
Well,
Crimea.
it was the Kerch Bridge, and I think
Thank
that
you.
was very much a legitimate target for the Ukrainians. I mean, it is a bridge which was built to annex Ukrainian territory, but it has raised obviously some escalation concerns in the Western capital. But again, I think the overall picture is that Ukraine is a country which is attacked by Russia, and which, even if there are actors in Ukraine that might have conducted operations which are not entirely what the West would support, that doesn't change the overall picture of Ukraine at war. I mean, it will certainly, if it is confirmed, and again, I find it very difficult to speculate because it's far from being any kind of assessment that one can rely on so far. So it will certainly have an impact on the kind of information that is passed, or certainly perhaps also a little bit on the trust of both sides. But this is entirely hypothetical at the moment. And again, for all countries, the situation remains the same, that Ukraine is attacked and that it will require support.
I think that's a pretty general, lacking nuance view of it, to be honest, because of course that is the case. Ukraine was attacked, they deserve support. But to act if Ukraine's best interest always aligns with the NATO's best interest is not exactly accurate either. Let me give you an example of that too. When there was a strike on a Ukraine city, there was a missile that landed in Poland. I'm sure you're familiar with this. And that missile killed two Polish civilians. So there you have two Polish civilians dead, and that is attack that could be construed as an attack on NATO. Right after this attack occurred, a Ukrainian minister, their state, came out and said that was a Russian missile without the full knowledge and truth of that matter. But it turned out that was not the case. It was a Ukrainian air defense missile. How would that not dramatically escalate the war if that was the case? And my point being here is that it's becoming to me ever more apparent, and I don't blame Ukraine for this at all, but it's becoming ever more apparent that Ukraine's best interest is actually to escalate to war, to make this a major power between major powers, to make this a war between major powers. Whereas our best interest, in my opinion, everyone's best interest, is to find a diplomatic solution as quick as possible. But
Well, I
that
think
does.
I
Mhm.
probably don't agree with that. I mean, I think the reaction to the anti-air defense debris, so the missile that hit Polish territory was in fact debris from Ukrainian
Yes.
air defense, which defended against Russian missiles at that moment. And we have seen a very calm and a very reasonable response on NATO's side from the Polish government, from
100%.
NATO's actors, which reacted to that. Again, of course, Ukraine has different interests than the West has, because the West is not existentially threatened, which
Hmm.
Ukraine is.
Yeah.
So, of course, it doesn't entirely align, but I don't follow your conclusion, and I don't agree that Ukraine is interested in an escalation of the war. What they are interested in is to get the maximum support of their Western allies to get Russia out of the territory. And that is a possibility that they have, a real possibility that they have. Whereas the risk for Ukraine to enter negotiations which are too early conducted on the basis of Russian demands, which so far have not indicated any willingness to compromise, but which basically stipulate that Ukraine should not only give up territory that is already controlled by Russia, but basically should add further territory and give away further territory, which they currently control, these 4 oblasts, these 4 provinces, to Russia. And those are linked to further Russian demands, a demilitarization of Ukraine,
Hmm.
denazification of Ukraine, which would in the end mean a Ukraine which would not be able to defend itself against Russia anymore, and which would mean that entering too early into negotiations on Russia's terms can lead us to an even longer war because Russia will use this not as a serious negotiation outcome, which they're willing to uphold. And let me remind you that in 2008 and 2014, Russia has not upheld the negotiated agreements that were found either, not in Georgia, not in Ukraine in 2014. So there's every reason to mistrust Russia's intentions and every reason to believe that sooner or later Russia will return to the war. And that is why a solution, a negotiated outcome, has to be conducted on the basis of a position of strength for Ukraine, and not on a basis where Ukraine surrenders to Russian demands and will, in a couple of years down the line, be confronted with another aggressive Russian attack, and the West will be confronted with another instance where they have to support a country against war. So a sustainable peace has to include an element of a just peace, because otherwise it will come back and haunt us and haunt Ukraine.
I think that's fair. I think when I say, and when I do say as quickly as possible, it doesn't mean this very moment. It means as quickly as possible, given some of the things you brought out, that it's not a demilitarization of Ukraine, that certain territory is not conceded, and that Ukraine remains a strong, formidable, say, military force in that region, and there's none of that. But just to quickly, I think 180, not 180, but to wrap this little segment up, would be the escalation of the war, where I think we're approaching it similarly, but using different words, which is, in a quick way to just align on this, is Zelensky would take fighter jets from the United States, requesting that. They request a no-fly zone originally too. They said it numerous times. That would be escalating the war. So maximum support and escalation of the war are kind of synonymous in certain instances. It's not always synonymous, but getting maximum support for Ukraine and escalating the war can be synonymous and have been with.
Well, I mean, even if Ukraine says it wants a no-fly zone over Ukraine, it doesn't say anything that NATO must do it. I mean, there were many demands in the past placed towards NATO allies, what it should do, what it can do, but the decision-making is entirely into NATO hands about what they want to do. So in the end, Ukraine can demand a lot, but that doesn't mean that this is becoming reality. And there is certainly a very broad, I mean, there has been a change in the support that Ukraine was given. So there was an increase of support for Ukraine over the last year, which also was a gradual increase of support to reduce escalation risk, to not have these big jumps in escalation support, to make sure that we don't find ourselves in a situation where we become surprised by Putin's reaction, by Russia's reaction. But there is this bright red line which runs between even fighter jets and between NATO's direct involvement with own troops. And this bright red line is something which is not a gradual increase. So it doesn't mean that we send tanks, we send fighter jets, and the next is NATO troops in Ukraine. But this is really qualitatively on a completely different level, and which is something which is ruled out not only in Washington, but also in all European capitals, including in countries in Central and Eastern Europe, such as in Poland, who are much more concerned about the risk to their own security. So I don't really see this as a risk. I only see this kind of escalation as a risk if we see a further step of the Russian side to escalate the war. So if Russia were to use nuclear weapons in Ukraine, for instance, that would be a major escalation. And another concern that I have here is certainly that although at some point negotiations would be desirable, and one can certainly disagree what this point is, I find myself wondering in recent times whether there's actually a willingness to negotiate regardless of the point from the Russian side, or whether domestically this situation of war is actually a situation that for the Russian president is quite comfortable. So what if a kind of forever war for Russia, just to continue the fight at all costs? is something which, from the perspective of the Russian president, is his best way to stay in power and his best way to continue the kind of power grip that he holds on Russian society. And I think that's a consideration that we should seriously take into account, that a continuation of this war has become existential for the regime and for the safety of the Russian president himself. And that would be quite a bleak outlook on any ideas of negotiations in the future, even if those are desirable.
So yeah, there was a lot there. Appreciate it. So with some of the red lines that we've said previously, just to clear up what I was saying is that Ukraine wanting maximum support and the escalation of the war, regardless of what NATO does, can sometimes be the same. If Ukraine wants troops on the ground, that could be looked at as, and this is a hypothetical, and they're not calling for this, but if they want troops on the ground, hypothetically, that could be looked at as maximum support. But that's also escalation of the war. So that's what I was saying. And moving forward, we originally said that we weren't going to supply Ukraine tanks, and that was a red line. But we are supplying them tanks now. So these red lines have changed. Whether they're for the better or for the worse, it's just they have changed. So there's that. And then I think that's an interesting point you bring up at the end regarding Putin and his place for power. I think it's possible. I don't think it's likely. If you look at Russia, the Soviet Union specifically, and the downfall of them, a large part of that was their invasion of Afghanistan. Afghanistan is looked at as the empire or the graveyard of empires, and their downfall for the Soviet Union was largely due to the fact of their involvement in Afghanistan. You want to talk about like the amount of casualties at home and domestic support that's happening. You can have the tight grip on your country and tight control in your country, but if your families are suffering the loss of loved ones year over year, you're going to lose support and you're going to lose political will, power, no matter how much you control that media, no matter how much you control almost most aspects of society, because that's loss of human life that people are feeling, not throughout the populace. It's not just a few throughout the populace, and that obviously compounds over time. But
I think that's quite an optimistic. I mean, I think it's a likely, and I would hope that this is true. But I think what makes me a little bit more pessimistic about this kind of idea that the body bags can change something is the way how the body bags are handled in Russia. So it is very different from the war in Afghanistan, where we had in the Soviet Union a strong voice and a strong presence of, for instance, committees of Russian mothers who were accepted and willing to protest and to voice their disagreements. There was discussion about the numbers of soldiers coming back to Afghanistan. Those are all things that we don't see in Russia right now. I mean, there's such a repressive environment that even the mothers of those who are coming back are not able, or don't feel they can speak out at all. So the numbers that are coming back in really an unprecedented way of body bags is something which at the moment is not leading to this kind of stimulus for protest in the society. And if we look back at the Soviet Union, I think it really took a long time from Afghanistan to the situation that we had someone like Gorbachev emerge, who questioned the idea of Russia's empire and who was willing to concede to Boris Yeltsin, who in the end was the person who said, well, I want my own power base, and that is based on nationality, and who was the one who pushed for a breakup of the Soviet Union, whereas Gorbachev more or less wanted to keep it. So it's a difficult debate about what sort of brought down the Soviet Union and what can bring down Putin. I think there's some similarities, but others make me more pessimistic because, I mean, if Putin is someone who is really on the side of the very repressive Russian leader, in Soviet history, it needed decades until from Stalin to Gorbachev, someone like Gorbachev could emerge. So I think the potential for sudden change in a system which Putin has co-opted, I mean, in this meeting that he held with his elites, he basically co-opted everyone and sort of everyone has now blood on their hands.
Mm-hmm.
And that makes it so difficult to imagine that domestic change can happen quickly and might have an influence on the way how Russia looks at this war.
No, that's some great call outs. I think my concern with, and this isn't any kind of pushback, but just furthering a concern is that if this was a prolonged war and Putin wants to go, a lot of people in the West specifically, in the United States specifically, call out Hillary Clinton for one, saying if you're close, in essence, if you're close to Putin as a staffer, like it's you have a due diligence to get rid of him. I can understand where that sentiment may come from, maybe source from, but I think there's also a naivete out there that the next person after Putin would be someone like a Gorbachev, since, as you point to, he's purged a lot of the dissent that isn't the only dissent that's really allowed in Russia is dissent that's more hawkish than what's currently happening. And
Absolutely.
and that's a concern of mine. People call for Putin's being taken out in essence because there's no guarantee that whoever comes after him will not be far worse or just as worse. But in my opinion,
I think I can sort of uh, calm your concerns in this regard, that because
okay.
I don't think there's anyone who is interested in regime change policy in Russia. And I think that has been very clear, not in Europe, not in Washington. And I think this has been made very clear by the Biden administration that what they want is to have Russia out of Ukraine. And that's where it ends. And even the language of strategic defeat that we've seen at the beginning of the war, the language of weakening Russia, has been taken back.
Yes.
Because it was perceived as being too, I mean, it's being misinterpreted as a US policy which goes after Putin, which the Biden administration is explicitly not doing. And I find this is something sometimes perhaps a little bit of a misperception of the administration. I find this is the case, by the way, often in Europe, that the Biden administration, in my view, is pursuing a relatively cautious and escalation-aware policy towards this war, and less of a hawkish, this is our opportunity to get rid of Vladimir Putin policy. Which, for instance, some people in Warsaw find too cautious and they find it too restrained. And I think that's actually a good, it might be a good position to be in if you still have people to your left saying, oh, you're too cautious and too restrained. And you have people on your right saying, you're not cautious enough. So perhaps being in the middle of that is actually a good position to be in. But the escalations concerns are sort of very present on the minds of policymakers in Washington.
Yeah, I'm glad you called that out because in the beginning the language was used a little differently, but over more recent months it has been more reined in to revolve around Russia out of Ukraine in essence.
Exactly, yeah.
Rather than
yeah, and that's really the aim. And it's, I mean, again, Russia is a nuclear power. I mean, there's just no there's just every interest to, in a situation of complete instability that Russia has brought about, to keep some stability with a nuclear power. And that means that even a dictator like Putin is protected by nuclear weapons. And that's something that other powers take into account, and why this regime change ideas that some may have is not something which is seriously pursued or considered in any capital.
Well, that's good to hear. And I know you have extensive experience in Germany, and I would like just to ask like a little into that. I read a few of your articles about Germans' aid and what should be and how it's maybe not living up to that, but to be patient because of certain limitations, we'll call them. And I would like to just ask a question on that, which is, what is Germany's current role in this war and conflict? And does that align with what it should be in this current war and conflict?
Yeah, it's surprising that when it comes to Germany, there's no other country where the gap between actual contributions and reputation is wider than Germany. So Germany has a very bad reputation. But if you look at the actual contributions that Germany is making, it is the second biggest European contributor in military, financial, humanitarian aid. In some aspects, it's even ahead of the United Kingdom. And what created this impression is that every step and decision that Germany took in the last year seemed to be taken with a lot of hand-wringing and pressure and hesitancy, which is frustrating. But if sort of looking at the outcome, it actually looks pretty good on the balance sheet. And many of the things that Germany has promised, including tanks for Ukraine, very developed air defense system, which not even the German army possesses, but which the industry produces, we see Germany really stepping up to the situation. What is lacking is a sense of urgency in transforming Germany's own security policy from military restraint, which was basically the post-1945 consensus, to rearmament and military power. There's a lot of bureaucratic inertia in there. There's a defense industrial base, which is just not developed enough. There are politicians who suddenly have to get used to this idea. So there are problems with implementation and with urgency. And then also, many other countries would like to see Germany taking more the lead. So, for instance, on the tank questions, Germany waited for the US to come along because they're concerned to go the step on their own. So there are many Europeans would certainly wish to see Germany being more willing to take risks, which are acceptable risks. So I don't belong to those who say this is all rhetoric from Germany, nothing is coming. I belong to those who believe in the change that we see in Germany, but sees also the constraints on German policymakers.
Interesting. I think some of the callouts too, you mentioned the post 1945, like when that timeline you offered, but it's also post Soviet Union, the collapse of the Soviet Union, that military personnel fell by 60% from 1990 to 2019, and that a defense minister soon after the invasion of Germany, her name is eluding my mind, but said they did not have one single ready combat division. So I think some of the critique kind of comes from Germany's readiness because of geopolitics, ready to defend itself and uphold NATO integrity. But I am appreciative of the insight you provide into that as well, being, how much extensive work and history you have in German institutions.
Well, I mean, I think in hindsight, it looks bad sort of looking at these numbers. But I mean, looking at 1990, I mean, that was very much the reality. And it was not only Germany that believed in a new age with reduced threats. And it was a general feeling that the kind of military power that was needed in Cold War times was not needed anymore. So I wouldn't reproach Germany for reducing its military in the 90s and in the early 2000s. What I would reproach Germany is for not reading the international environment correctly enough and not quickly enough realizing that times have changed. So at latest after 2014, after the annexation of Crimea, there was a lot of rhetoric in Germany about changing role, but nothing really apart from a little bit increase of defense budget, which was still far away from 2%. So it was sort of this hope that one could still cling to the old world, and the new world would just take more time to show up, which in 2022 became clear is not the case. So now this U-turn that Germany tries to do is really necessary because there was basically a lost decade in German politics. And that, again, makes it so frustrating for Germany's allies to observe because they've been warning all along. But that does not mean that Germany is generally unwilling and generally a free rider and piggybacking on its allies.
Yeah, I think a large part of that, and a large part of former President Donald Trump's criticism came from not just Germany's, but also the majority of NATO countries that did not meet that 2% pledging of their GDP to defense spending. And
Absolutely.
that was, oh yeah, the majority. That wasn't just Germany. That was a lot of countries. But I thank you for your time. I thank you for your
Absolutely.
insights.
Thank you for the conversation.
Of course, it provides some great insights. I'm sure my audience will appreciate it. And I also like to offer one last quick question, which is when someone is looking at this issue and they're curious about understanding it from not like a both sides thing, because that's more for like domestic issues, say, but holistically understanding the depth of this issue, say, and not just superficially saying X and Y, what would you recommend doing? What would you recommend studying or looking into if someone were to understand the actual depth of the Ukrainian Russian war and how that predates all the way like hundreds of years, but even more recently in the Soviet Union and the Ukrainian war for independence?
Mhm. What I thought was a very good book was by Orlando Fix, The Story of Russia. Because what it helps is it basically tells Russian history, but not in a boring history book way.
Mm-hmm.
But it basically tells what kind of narratives and stories and myths have the Russian people told themselves over centuries, and how has this myth making contributed to where we are right now. And I think that's a very helpful perspective, because what we have often overlooked is the kind of ideological radicalization that we see right now in Russia, and that we have tried too often to explain away as, security concerns. This is just a broader security question. But there are underlying historical traditions in the way how Russia perceives its walls that
Mm-hmm.
go back really for centuries. And there I find these books so useful, because it also helps to understand why Ukraine, in Putin's worldview, is really sort of the crown jewel in an imperial understanding of Russia's role, and why this imperial understanding of Russia's role has basically been unbroken for such a long time. And for me, it was particularly interesting to compare that with German history, and how in German history there was a very clear break in imperial understanding, but also after a very two major
Mm-hmm.
catastrophes of war in Europe. And to understand sort of this kind of myth making in Russia about its role in the world, what Russians told themselves about their own role, I can really recommend this book very much.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And thank you for your time.
Thank you. Have a good
All right.
day.
I'll see you guys.